Well, good morning and welcome to today's live stream. This is Peter Frank with Concordia Technology Solutions, joining you for the first time in several weeks. I feel kind of rusty and out of the loop on this. Our summer intern Audrey has done a fantastic job of kind of leading these videos the last 3 weeks, and Rachel was with her last week, which was good. It's given me a chance to focus on some other projects. We've been doing our annual business planning, so it's been nice to have others fill in for me, but I am happy to be back here today. And today we are in that kind of planning mode. We're going to be talking about establishing planning rhythms in the church and some of the key things about the church that make that both necessary but also maybe a little bit easier. And so today I am joined by Katy Munson, who is a DC serving in the area of communications and connections in Rockford, Illinois at Mount Olive Lutheran Church. Katy, how are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me, Peter.
Thanks for coming back in. Whoops, I'm just knocking over my laptop. Thanks for joining us again. You are a frequent guest. I don't know how many times this has been for you on live video, but you've been blogging for us for about 3 years now, I think. Is that right?
Wow. Wow. Time flies when you're having fun.
I know. Is it? I think it's 3 years. I think it was 2015 we started.
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So thanks for continuing to contribute. You always have such wonderful insight that you share, and I know this post in particular is especially intriguing to me. When we talked about it, you had some fantastic ideas, and so I was like, yes, I can't wait to read it. And you did not fail you did not disappoint. That's the way to say that. You can tell I'm a little out of the rhythm on this. So speaking of rhythms, that is the post for today. So Katy wrote a post for the CTS blog, and we'll share the link shortly, about establishing planning rhythms in the church. So let's just start off by talking about this idea of planning rhythms. I do not have any kind of musical ability, so hearing the word rhythm kind of scares me. I can't even clap along with a song. But what are planning rhythms? What do you mean by that term?
Well, I am also very low on the musical gifting scale, but I recently began taking piano lessons, and I didn't realize how essential learning the rhythm would be, along with notes and chords and all of that fun stuff. But all of these elements come together kind of in this series or this cycle, maybe a pattern would be another word to use, that creates some type of experience, of course, in the sense of music. You're creating a song or a sound, but there's this sense of timing that contributes to this greater picture, is what I would call that within planning. So how we plan and execute things becomes that rhythm.
That's good. And I know you've done a lot of research on this topic. You said this was kind of a reoccurring theme, right?
Yeah, just researching other things, the idea of rhythm, and especially as it connects to habits and how our habits form rhythms, and then our rhythms support those habits, whether they are intentional, not intentional, healthy, or maybe not the greatest for us and our planning and our work in the church or personally.
Very good. Well, let's talk about one of the kind of planning rhythms, which is the liturgical church year. Now, within the Lutheran Church, we have two different church year calendars. We've been talking about that a lot recently as we are getting ready to move into the new church year. There's the 1-year lectionary with the kind of the historic lectionary, and the 3-year lectionary, which goes on a rotation. So most churches follow these lectionaries. Talk to us a little bit about the liturgical calendar and how that kind of supports this idea of planning rhythms. First off, let's talk about how practical the calendar is for a congregational setting.
Yes. From the practical side of things, it's there. It's done. It's not something you have to create. It's the same every year, so we're learning, or we can draw on what we learned from previous years, which we'll talk about, I think, a little bit later. And it's done for you. It's a gift. That's what I would say at its simplest form.
I can't even imagine having to go through and pick the readings for every Sunday, year in, year out, while trying to keep it consistent. And that's, like you said, a wonderful gift. We talked about this, the church year, from a communication standpoint with Pastor Daniel Ross, and he described these major events like Christmas and Easter as sort of the tent poles for church communications. And we're going outside just communications today and talking about planning in general, this idea of everything of management of a church, whether it is the events that are going on or communications in a general or very specific sense. But talk to us about how these less major, or I guess you could call minor festivals, really are supported by the calendar, and how having that calendar really helps with the planning rhythms.
Absolutely. One of the examples I mentioned in the blog was...
Uh-oh. I think we just lost Katy. So she was talking as we were getting ready about the internet troubles they've been having there at her church. And so she had joined with, or had received help from a friend with a connection at their house. So she'll be back on in just a moment. Thank you for your patience. That's one of the things that you can't plan for, is all this different technology. So Katy, welcome back.
Oh, thanks. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem.
As far as the minor festivals go, though, there's, or maybe not the ones we are, minor in the sense that they're not as talked about, not in their significance at all. But
Sure.
We were talking about a way to celebrate God's gift of baptism in our congregation, and of course, baptisms happen throughout the year, but to have this time where we see who God has brought into our family through the waters of holy baptism, and different service times and dates and Sundays don't always allow for everyone to know what's happening in that area. So let's find a time where we can do this. Well, one of my coworkers, brilliant as she is, said, well, we're celebrating the baptism of our Lord, on this particular Sunday. Why don't we create something, a slideshow was the avenue we went of pictures of from each baptism. So then we're seeing this collectively and as a whole church body, even though it happened at a time and place that might have been more particular, and not everybody would have been there for that event. So that's one way we use that. And so then planning some of more the nuts and bolts, that was the point that we worked back from. So we needed, a photographer to make sure that they're taking, we have that picture. We needed to know where that picture ended up. So we needed a system for that. But that all was founded in that festival in the church year.
So kind of using the church year as your basis and saying, what can we do how can we leverage this to support the planning, but probably also triggering these ideas of how can we use the church year to teach about this, or to, in this case, remember the baptisms. I think it's almost like having that map in front of you to start, and then filling in the gaps from there. Is that an accurate description?
Yes, absolutely. That's spot on.
Good. Well, let's talk about evaluating rhythms in the church. And so as you go about planning things for the church, it's important to review this regularly. That can be said for really any plan. But can you talk about why it seems like we do the same things every year without recognizing it? That's something you talked in the post, and how evaluating it can kind of help you understand these rhythms and even help document them.
Yes, this is where those unintentional rhythms that became really apparent to me. With the both the liturgical calendar and then things within more our particular context, whether that be a wider context like churches in America, or if we're in more rural areas, that agricultural calendar begins to drive things. just all of those different things come together and cause us to do things at certain times in the year, and they might trigger a thought, oh, I should really start working on that closer to the time of an event or a project. But when we're not, or when we take that time to evaluate and to say, hey, this is happening every time, then we can start planning sooner. And just that move from unintentional to intentional is where I see that that evaluation coming in.
So how do you start this, or how would one begin this process of evaluating the planning rhythms in their church? What would you recommend?
Something that I have found very valuable and was introduced to when I did my DCE internship. The intern before me was a fabulous planner and documenter of said plans. And she had for me a binder that was about like this thick, I feel like. No joke. And it had everything month by month. And so as we would come up to something, it was all of the church calendars, and you could just see how the church calendar for October, event-wise, looked a lot alike the as you look throughout the years, and so we would know that this parent training event was coming up then, things like that. So looking at calendars, this might be depending on your church, a paper calendar. It might also be more digitally based, but that looking at the calendar is huge.
Good. Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about planning to plan. That's something. Oops, it looks like we just lost Katy. So I'll describe a little bit about her blog post where she described this process of really setting aside time to plan out your plans, which kind of seems bad. And I'm curious as to if you're already bad at start planning, how do you plan to plan? So Katy, welcome back. I was just talking about how this idea of planning to plan might be difficult if you're already bad at planning. So let's take a step before evaluating your plans, and what do you need to start planning? What if you don't have that binder that has been so well laid out? What are your first steps in planning?
Scheduling time, and that as few as 10 minutes, I think, to get started. As soon as adult learners, we tend to want content that is going to apply to our lives and make it better, hopefully, or add value in some way. So as we see the value that 10 minutes set aside, of whether that's 10 minutes to look at where we've been planning wise, or to then look ahead, maybe just start with what's happening a month down the road, and what's one thing that I can identify right now that I can go and do that will contribute to that end goal or project or event. But what's that part of the process? So if I'm going to look at the beginning of Sunday school, let's say, a lot of churches are going to maybe start their new education year, kick that off after Labor Day. We're about a month out from that now. So I could probably spend about 15 minutes today and create my list of families that are in the congregation, that have been involved in our summer ministries, basically anybody who's going to receive that invitation. And I'm just going to create that list right now with their address or their email address, whatever information we're using. And so that whole process will probably take maybe 30 minutes, and it's done and it's foundational, and then you can build on that. So when you want to send that postcard, you're not like, oh no, who am I sending it to?
I love that concept of that foundation, because so often when you take on a big project, in my head is our annual business planning process. We've just kind of wrapped up the first round of that. But having that groundwork makes every single preceding task seem a little bit easier, because now it's not a whole project, it's just individual steps. So I really like that idea of setting the foundation. Well, good. Let's talk about the difference between planning and executing, or starting tasks or actually doing tasks. We talked about this a little bit in preparation for this post. This idea of being in these modes of either being in a planning mode or being in a taskmaster mode. Is it possible to be in both? And is there any benefits to doing that, or maybe doing one or the other?
Yeah. I think it is possible to be in both, but again, I have just found and have been very convicted of in my own practices that it goes back to that planning and having that mindset going in, knowing what's expected or anticipating how things are going to go. Obviously, as we've seen today too, you have to be flexible. Things are going to come up, but having that foundation that we were just talking about is going to...
All right, looks like Katie's cut out again, so we'll wait for her to come back. I can tell you one of the things that I try to do as I plan, and even as I am taking action or executing, is setting things up for the next year and say, okay, I really wish I would have had this year. So let me take a few extra minutes now while I'm taking action, and begin planning for that again next year. And it's not just doing something that's going to be solve the problem now, but say, what can I do to make sure that it's going to be even easier next year, so that I can take it, any of my actions to the next step next year. So Katie, I think we've got you back now. Sorry about that.
No, I'm sorry. I think that in terms of it being possible to be planning and executing at the same time, I have found that that idea of seasons or rhythms, and especially looking at the liturgical calendar, to be executing for one season, and in execution mode for one season, and in planning mode for another. So I've already done the thinking for what I'm executing right now, and there will be things that we're going to tweak along the way and have that, but we have that space for that process because we've done the thinking beforehand and gathered different insights. But then, since we're removed from what's coming up, we're able to do the planning for that. And especially for those of us working in the church, it can be Advent. My first few Advents, I think I wrote a post about this. I was so behind and just trying to survive Advent that I wasn't receiving the gift that Advent is to us, as to myself as a Christian, and what God teaches and does in that. So that has really helped to drive that point home in my own life.
Sure, absolutely. And I think that can be one of those things that just makes you wish you had done planning, but it doesn't always lead to planning when you're missing out. What are some of those roadblocks to planning that you see or experience in the church? And do you have any suggestions on how to overcome those roadblocks?
Yeah. In the church, there are so many good things happening, so many things going on, and God working through different ministries and individuals, and knowing, and as leaders, we have the joy of hearing about those things and sharing those things. But we also have the responsibility to filter for, I think there's a better word out there for that, but to recognize what is going to be more valuable for the whole, and then where to direct things to particular audiences, which people much smarter than I know a whole lot more about, like yourself. But that's a roadblock, the sense of urgency, and that because everyone who has something, what they're doing is important, and it is important, but it might not be what's best for everybody to be in on, or for you to be spending your time on. So finding ways to develop systems to say that is a priority for my time right now, that's a priority for my time a month from now, or that's something that we should be thinking about for next year so that we can more fully plan for that. So I see that just the urgency of the present as a huge roadblock. And then outside influences or outside factors. As far as overcoming those roadblocks, I have found creating systems of accountability and encouragement are very, very helpful. So I meet weekly with our pastor, and we look both at the week ahead, and then we take a 3-month outlook to see what needs to be happening, if things should be on the calendar that aren't, who's going to be involved, just all sorts of details like that. And those meetings are usually 20 to 30 minutes tops, but they really do set the tone and keep us accountable and encouraged, because it's always nice to be like, oh, hey, guess what? This is 4 months out and we already have this done, and how awesome is that? So celebration is, I would say, a good thing too.
That's awesome. That idea of accountability, I think often we hear that word accountable and it seems like somebody is, kind of reviewing your to-do list and seeing, all right, have you done everything? And that's not really what you're saying. I like that you bring that encouragement factor into that. I know that for me, just talking to somebody, okay, here are my priorities right now and here are my actions. It's easy for those to become misaligned because everything seems urgent, like you were saying before. But somebody else on the outside can hear those things and say, okay, your actions and your priorities aren't aligning right now, and really just help you get that accountability back. It's not a negative thing, although I think we can also often think of that, of somebody pointing out flaws or mistakes. But I really like that you brought that encouragement in and pointing those things that you've done well. Really helps keep your focus. So great suggestions. I know you've done a lot of research on this, and I know that we've only scratched the surface of planning in the church, or planning in general. Where would you suggest our viewers go to learn more about planning? What has been helpful to you?
Well, you're very generous in saying I've done a lot of research. I feel like there are people who have done far more research than I. But the places that I have found most valuable for learning are blogs, like Daniel's on the major festivals and planning church communications, those really sparked interest. And then podcasts, I think I've mentioned before, I probably need a shirt that says, so I was listening to this podcast and ... But the two that interestingly have been, well, one makes a little more sense, and we've talked about it in terms of storytelling, is building a story brand with Donald Miller. He talks a lot about corporate practices as well, and personal growth things, and there has been a fair amount of content on planning in his podcast and learning from other leaders. And then the Entree Leadership podcast from Ramsey Solutions has also been very valuable. And just hearing the success, as we mentioned before, talking about how we, as adult learners, want things that apply to us, but we also want to see how it's working in somebody else's life. You get those stories, and then you hear how it was built up, how that success had been built up. So those are the two that I would recommend.
Very good. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insight. Thank you for writing the post for us, Katy. I think it just gets me more excited to become better at planning and seeing those rhythms and seasons of the church year, and really utilizing them and leveraging them to make planning a much more realistic thing for both me and for others in the church. So I appreciate you being here today, and for our viewers, thank you for watching. We've shared the link to the blog. Be sure to go check that out and read through Katy's post. We'll be back next week with another great topic. We're going to be talking about the idea of thank yous and how important that is in communications, but also in management of the church. And we're going to talk about this idea of development and fundraising. And so Jen will be joining us next week on that. So thank you very much for being here today, and have a great rest of the week.